So we're back to the puzzle grind. We'll see if we're up to crossing 2800 today. First puzzle of the day. Seems like we're having a lot of pieces floating around white's king. So quick glance at the material shows that we're down a bishop. So at the very least we need to win something. Well, likely this is going to be checkmate. We already have 3 pieces floating around a pretty, let's say, ensnared king. So the first move that should come to mind, and is almost certainly the right first move, is just taking this pawn. It's a unprotected pawn, or well, not protected enough, and comes with a pretty strong follow-up. So the question is, how can we turn that into mate? So when we're calculating that, it's really just a matter of almost just brute force calculation. There are only 3 places black's king can go, and right off the bat, let's just eliminate some of the lesser possible ones. And the reason why I'm doing it in that order is because if those don't work, then the whole thing doesn't work. But this still might be the right first move, just because we have the potential to maybe win a piece. So the least likely move I'm just going to get rid of right now. Of course, I think it's possible to do it from the most likely move. I just have fallen into the habit of doing it this way. So if king h1, I think we just get a quick checkmate after rook takes. King has to come over because that rook is protected. Then you have the other rook coming in, and then you deliver mate. So this one is out of the question. I think for the same reason, this one's out of the question, because in that case we would come here, and then we'd end up checkmating on this square instead. So that means that this is an absolutely forced move. And then we start that kind of process of elimination again. So the most forcing continuation from that point would be to take the knight. We do give up our knight, but we're getting close to making something happen with the king here. So for instance, after those moves, we can't quite yet take this pawn because the king guards it, but we could force the king to step away from that pawn. So I think that in the event when we play this pawn forward, so at this point the king is, our rook is here, this pawn is gone, and the king is here. So we push our pawn up. The king has 2 options left, because the king can't go back, and the king can't step to this file. Even though the rook is here, these pawns guard it. I would think that really the only move to consider is king takes pawn, because if we go here, we're going to take this rook, or this rook is going to take this pawn with check, and this move will be forced anyways. So really we would just get to include this rook move for free. And there's no way that that can be good for white, because then it makes these mating ideas of maybe playing g6 check, and then king comes up, and then rook takes the other pawn to get some sort of file mate here, even stronger. So after the forced sequence here, takes on f2, king h3, rook h2, king g4, h5, king takes h5, rook takes g3, with the very strong threat of playing g6 followed by rook takes h4. White needs a defense there. And if white can defend, then we have to consider some other options. But I don't think white can defend. So in that instance, king is here, rook just took, and there's a rook here. So white, neither rook can give us check. This knight's not close enough to give check. So really, white's only defense that I can see, since they can't stop g6, they have to stop the follow-up, which is rook takes h4. So maybe they'll play their rook to h1 to get behind our rook. So even when we play g6, then king comes to h6, and we can't take this pawn so easily. But even in that event, maybe we can just start with king h7 and threaten g6. And the point is that we've covered this h6 square. Our rook is standing here, so this is going to be checkmate, because we're cutting off this file. and white won't be in time. It won't matter that white can take our rook. So I think this is just going to be a mating net after here, 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 and a move I didn't consider, but that shouldn't change anything. I just take that. So, all right, we cross this 2800 threshold, which is nice. It took a little bit of time on that puzzle, but definitely satisfied with that calculation. So moving on to the next puzzle right away. A couple things to note. Our king is very exposed. For instance, something like this could lead to trouble, even if we come to g2. Well, first of all, this rook is already protected, so we have to be careful about nasty follow-ups like queen f3, for instance. I guess that doesn't matter that this rook is protected there. But already that would just be a perpetual. So if we want to make something happen, we need to be quick. The first move that comes to mind for me was to do this kind of typical sacrifice, because when the king steps over, our queen can come in. The other move that we would consider is playing queen a7. Okay, well, this is already a fork, so we'd have to take, and then rook takes. And then maybe we would win this bishop. But even in that event, we're still down a piece, right? Looks kind of scary for black, but I'm more interested in seeing what happens after this first, because after takes, does the king really have an option besides taking back? It doesn't look like it, because if king comes here, this is just mate. And the other squares are all covered. These are both covered. And in that case, the rook would cover as well. And this square is covered, naturally. So after rook takes, king takes, we get our queen in. That was the point of sacrificing the rook. And really, black only has one move, which is knight to d7. And the question is, do we have a follow-up there? And the answer is yes, we have queen d6, protected conveniently by our pawn. These squares are still covered, so after takes, takes, queen check, knight blocks, queen here, king has to come back. Then we can just add in our last piece, and that looks like that's going to be mate. So, again, a move I did not consider. But I think this still works. So yeah, my calculations, by not considering these defensive options, my calculations are getting a bit lazy. Here I think we can repeat once. And because that knight is gone, then it's almost the same, because now our rook can come in. So although I'm getting these puzzles, I do feel that I'm not doing it quite properly because I'm missing some of these defensive resources. Well, the other one I don't feel like. That knight desperado move was something that you didn't have to calculate because there was no way for white really to open up. Well, that's not entirely true. I didn't consider that that knight desperado covered that crucial checkmate square in the puzzle, and if that had opened up a rook maybe for check or something, that could have changed the outcome of the puzzle. So yeah, so I should consider these defensive resources a little more carefully. So let's try to do that in this puzzle. So here, do we have to be urgent? Maybe. So okay, so black has a threat here. Something like this. Maybe the more urgent threat is actually to go d1. The point being that after we take that, our queen hangs. So, or of course this is a big threat too, now that I think about it. But at least in that case, actually, we could take back with the queen, because we are currently up a rook. So there are a couple moves we can make. So I am noticing, one of the first things I'm doing here is I am trying to see, like, what if it wasn't our turn? That helps us ascertain, like, what is black's threat? What does our move have to accomplish in terms of black's threats as well? Because it doesn't look like we have a check. It looks like one of our first moves is going to be some rook move. And if that's the case, that means that black's going to get a free hand to do something. So even if queen c1, like let's say for instance after like rook f1, queen c1, I do think that at the very least white can step out of the domain here. Like we don't have to take followed by takes, although we certainly could. But it does seem after queen c1, we could just move our king and leave this checkmate option. So that's kind of nice to note. So now the question becomes, what's the actual point of this puzzle? So it looks like rook f1 is the obvious move, certainly. But, because you're thinking, oh, let's get out of taking the rook, let's protect the queen, let's make a checkmate threat. But if rook e to f1, there is this move d1 queen, or d1 queen. And the problem is that if we take that pawn now, or that new queen now, we hang our queen just like before. So if we were to go here and they were to make a queen, we might have to play king a2, but then there's checkmate, because this queen covers here, and our rooks are cut off from defending the b1 square. So if we play rook f1, we might just lose on the spot. So rook f1 is probably not the answer. So is rook h to f1 the answer? If it's not, then we might just have to play some sort of play some defense real quick. So let's see if we can make rook h to f1 work, or at least see what the result might be after rook h to f1. So the first move to calculate, of course, is pawn takes rook. And in that case, we would have to take with the queen, and that might be holdable. We're not immediately losing. Okay, maybe black has some extra pawn, but his remaining pawns are all lined up quite unconvincingly. Maybe this is just fine for white. Maybe the point here is just to not lose. But if we're just going to not lose, then maybe we would just prefer to keep our rook, is my thinking. So rook d1 or rook to b1. Maybe there's no reason for us to allow this check at all. Because if we play rook to d1, and they play queen c1, and we even come here, there is rook to c2, isn't there? And then maybe we have to take after all. But again, if we play rook to b1, there is this d1 move, making the queen, and then our queen's undefended. So, not sure if I've missed something yet, but so the thought process so far was that after rook h to f1, black can simplify down into this endgame. So if we can play a move like rook d1 and it doesn't lose, it's probably going to be better, because then we could follow up with rook h to f1. So after rook to d1, the only move I really see for black at this point is to play queen c1, and then the move I want to play as, oh wait, I can play rook takes queen c1. I was forgetting that I have my rooks doubled up here. So after rook d1, queen c1 takes, even if rook takes, I can just step up, and they can't queen. And even if they take my rook, I can take the pawn. That should be a winning endgame. So after rook d1, actually I don't know what black does, which means it's probably just the right move. So let's just do this. And then here, I just have to step up. Let me just double check this though. If we take this rook and he makes a queen, and I play king a2, I think black's probably forcing this pawn through, so I just have to give up the rook. And then win this pawn somehow by queen e2. I did notice there that I was implicitly saying he for my opponent, which I probably shouldn't do, so my apologies. Anyways, moving on to the next puzzle. Seems like it's another mating net style puzzle. Like moves that immediately stand out to me are Moves like knight h1, which give check to the king and force the king a bit further up. Knight h1 comes to mind, even though it's putting the knight on the corner here, because otherwise we just get taken anyways. And it does seem like, again, taking in consideration of all the board position here, that we should be pretty urgent. Not only this isn't just perpetual, because of this bishop, it looks like white's actually threatening some sort of rook mate. Or, even at the very least, just win the knight this way. We can't just protect the knight like this and hope to make some sort of checkmate. So, but if we just play, our rook up, then they take and hide the king. So that's not going to work. And we can't play here without allowing this. So that's why knight h1 seems like the first move, and it only has one response by white, so that's a good start. Then I would prefer to use this rook. I think if I start with this rook, then we start to step on each other's toes, right? So if I use this rook, then I can still reserve this rook to get added in. So far we have knight h1, king f3, rook 1 to e3, at which point black does have two squares. So let's just pick one. Let's say king comes to f4 so that there's no possibility for knight check. Whether or not that would be good for black is unclear. Then, let's say I bring the other rook in, at which point, even if the king were on g4, well, if the king's on f4, there's only one choice, which is onwards and forwards. And if the king had been on g4, there would have been this choice as well. In both cases, we do have the knight coming back to g3, which would force the king here. And unfortunately, we don't have a rook on the e5 square to deliver mate. And rook here doesn't deliver mate because of this pawn. So if I can somehow change the position slightly, alter the position slightly to get a rook on e5, then I think we would just have some sort of mating net. So after check, check, can I benefit by making this extra check? And the king would come back here. And I don't have rook here, unfortunately, because that square is unprotected, so I can't deliver mate like that. So after check, 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 let's say king steps up somewhere, I can give check again, at which point the king can't step forward because this would be mate. So the king, regardless if the king was here or here, the king would have to step back to one of these two squares, at which point we could then bring the other rook in. Check, so now the king gets forced back to f3. So currently in that calculation, the king's on f3, and we have rooks here and here. And how can we improve the position from that point? Oh, wait, hang on. I overlooked this move g5. That might be really important. So after check, 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 so the king can't step back, check. If the king were to step to f4, we'd at the very least have g5. And then king would step here. Maybe that's not quite working. I don't see how we... Because we kind of let the king dance around the file. I think I'm missing something really simple here, actually. There's got to be some sort of net there. But my calculation's a little wonky. Check. Check. Then we get the rook to e5 like we wanted. King steps back somewhere. Well, in the event that the king ends up on g4, we do have knight f2. The king steps somewhere. then what? This is where I have to really put on my thinking cap. Yeah, visualization is really important, and I'm just personally struggling here. Maybe the viewer would find this not such a hard calculation, but bear with me while I take a few minutes. So at this point, we wanted the rook on e5. It won't do much good to repeat. So, but this rook is I can't just bring this rook over somewhere because this rook is undefended. But even if I were to go there and the king were to come back, I don't see an obvious follow-up. So I do want to force the king to do something. Oh, well, the king couldn't go to here without allowing rook to g3, which I'd overlooked. So like for instance, after check, 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 if the king were to come to g4, then I'd have rook to g3, protected by the knight. And then if king were to come here, I'd have a mate. And if king were to come here, then I have rook check. King comes here, then I'd have rook checkmate. So essentially after here, 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 I'm using this and this interchangeably because no matter what happens after this, here, or here, and rook back, the king will step back, and we just eliminated g4 as a square. So the king will step back to f4, at which point, if the king were to have stepped to g4, we would get rook here like we wanted. So can we force the king to step to g4? What if after king f4 we just played rook to g3, which threatens g5 mate, and also protects the g7 square. So if white wants to stop mate, they have to give up a rook. That might be our best option, actually. So let's play this. Knight check, check. Oh no. You hate to see it. I gained a point for losing that puzzle, which means that this puzzle must be quite highly rated after only getting the first move right, and the first move is quite obvious. That's kind of funny. Wait, so if this isn't the move, what is the move? Because I thought my solution there was pretty convincing. Is it here? I'll be honest, I didn't actually give rook f1 a strong thought, which is a bit unfortunate, but I didn't think of it because I thought my solution worked. So let's give it a fresh look. After, well, rook f1, which has to be the move now. Then I can give check. Okay, so that same idea is not working. So what's the point here? I just have rook check. Oh my gosh. Oh, so it says braiding is pending. That's the first time I've seen that. It's not been played enough times, but the pass rate's quite low. Alright, I got a bit lucky there in terms of the rating gain. But yeah, this is actually quite simple. That's a bit sad that I missed that. I can get this idea of checkmate here like I wanted in a much more efficient way by having an actual staircase. So, unfortunate. Let's move forward because these are taking a little more time. So, okay, obvious white has set up a threat on our rook. We have a threat on c2. We can play rook b1 as well. If we play rook b1 right away, Even if the bishop were to come back, it's not really protecting c2 because we can take that and then take on c2. Currently, if we win this bishop, we will be up a piece. So the idea of rook b8 isn't such a bad idea. Like, it's not necessary that this is a good move, because after maybe knight c2, check, let's say king d1. If we just take here, this is a trade, which isn't what we want. So we'll probably play rook b1 at that point. Then if bishop to e4, and we take and take, we still win the rook. So it's not clear to me yet what the difference is, whether we start here or whether we start here. It looks like both have some theme of winning material. So let's try to eliminate one of them. After rook to b1, which is the lesser of the it's less forcing than the check, is there some response that we didn't quite consider for white? Actually, now that I think about it, I did overlook that if this knight's already on c2, this is not after, this is a different order of moves, but I just noticed, or it just occurred to me that we free up this c6 square for check on the king. White can save the bishop, and then maybe white can save the rook, maybe by playing rook to b1. And we don't have, since the rook is guarded, we don't have a convenient discovered attack, and if we move the knight back, then maybe the rook can step back to the corner. Maybe, because when we move the knight back, we are also attacking this bishop. But at that point, the bishop, okay, the rook doesn't have to move back to the corner. At that point, the bishop could come and block. And there's no fork threat anymore. So I think we should definitely start with this move. Just take that and then win the rook. Okay. Good so far. I think we have one more puzzle to do. Alright, so what's going on here? Okay, well obviously our knight's attacked. White's uncastled, so there's potential to kind of disrupt white's life a little. Doesn't really look like we have entry squares for our rook to get some sort of in-between move, since the bishop guards this square and the bishop guards this square. We don't have a great entry square for our queen either. So I think the natural move to start with is, if we play bishop b4, are we accomplishing something? Well, it seems pretty forcing, because these squares are both covered pretty well, and this square is covered pretty well. So if we play bishop b4, and white doesn't want to lose material, they just have to play king f1. Does that leave us any follow-ups? Well, maybe. At the least now we can move our knight forward rather than backwards. So let's say we give this check. Bishop b4, king f1, knight d2, check. And let's say white doesn't react to that. Like, white doesn't take it. White just says, okay, you've given me check. Let's keep running. Do we have a... we're not really forking anything, are we? So what's the follow-up there? So at that point, though, it just occurred to me that we have rook takes bishop. We've uncovered this rook to attack the bishop with check, which suggests that this is a much more forcing move than I thought. So after here, sorry, not there, here, we're attacking this bishop, which I'd overlooked for a second here, which means probably we'll have bishop takes, and then we can do rook takes. Some more forcing moves. So we attack the queen, we attack the bishop. Queen has to find a good square. Bishop is still guarded for the moment. So where would the queen go? Well, Let's say the queen goes to some super passive square. That would never happen, like queen c1. What would we follow up with? Would we take this bishop? Could we? And then king takes, and then what's the follow-up there? Queen takes pawn, and then maybe queen blocks. Then we have to do something, and maybe we hope to get the rook, our other rook involved. There's probably got to be something better than that. We could, so let's say, just to go over again, check, check, here, some queen move. We could just take this pawn then, which threatens the bishop quite strongly. So, at which point the bishop probably has to move. It's difficult to defend that bishop. But it's hard to defend that bishop. Like queen c4 seems to be the only move that guards it. If the bishop were to move, then we might have some way of bringing our other rook in or something like that. Before I get too deep in the woods here, after check in here, do I have a different discovered attack on this bishop? I've been overlooking some simple moves so far, so it's worth considering. Like some backwards knight move somehow. If it's not check though, then perhaps white just moves the bishop. And here the bishop can take. So bishop check here. It doesn't really make that much more sense to take with the bishop here. So rook takes, queen moves somewhere. Even if queen were to move to b3, attacking our bishop, it's still take on e5. Because of the threat on this bishop, there's no time for white to take. This bishop will still have to move, and we might have a strong follow-up there with like rook e1, for instance. Or depending on where the queen is, maybe queen e3. I've spent a lot of time on this already, so I am going to break one of my rules and just do the solution that I think is right. Check. And then here, since we got this far, I planned on taking here. I'll just check one more time. Well, not check the king, but double check my answer one more time. Is it worth trading queens? Also, sorry for the background noises if you can hear that. I forgot to turn off my notifications for a different app. If I take the queen, I do still win a pawn, but because white's king is in such danger, it makes more sense to me to take something with a major threat. So, ended up being the right solution. It did look quite strong, which is why I ended up going for it anyways. But if it wasn't under time pressure, I may have thought about it a little more. But also in a practical blitz game, for instance, you wouldn't be able to have that train of thought anyways. So, a moderately successful day. I think every puzzle we gained rating, which was just mostly fortune considering that we gained rating on the puzzle that we lost. But since we're gaining rating, I think the next target's definitely going to be 2850, since we already covered half the ground for that today, just about. And then if we can get that quite shortly, then we can think about going further. It would be nice to get 3000 rated on the puzzles. That's just a nice a nice millennium to hit. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in a future part of this series.